worked really hard over the last couple of weeks to effortfully encode the information for your upcoming test, and you've also successfully stored this encoded information in your memory. What is the key cognitive faculty that can help you on the day of the test to make the most of this encoded information? It is the cognitive faculty of memory retrieval. Hello and welcome everyone to the next video in the memory series, wherein we discuss and learn about the topic on memory retrieval. This is the fourth video in the series. You can find the list of all the topics we aim to cover in this series below in the description box, as well as also pinned to the comments section. We've already covered 3 videos in this series. In the first video, we discussed briefly what is memory and looked at an overview of the stages of memory formation. In the second video in this series, we focused on learning about the first stage of memory formation in detail, which is encoding. In the third video in this series, we learned about the second stage in memory formation, which pertained to learning about memory storage as well as the multi-store memory model in great detail. You can find the link of all these videos in the description box below, and they will also be pinned to the comment section. Now, it is recommended that you watch all of these videos before you proceed with today's video in order to progress through the topics in a more logical fashion. However, if you are already well versed with the definition of memory and are aware of the different types of encoding and what encoding is, and can explain the concept of memory storage as well as the Atkinson and Shiffrin's multi-store model of memory storage, then please feel free to go further on with today's video. With that said, let's proceed and look at what we will cover in today's video. So we start our video by asking the question, what is memory retrieval? Following that, we proceed to look at the different types of memory retrieval. In that, we cover the first type of memory retrieval, which pertains to studying about recall. We cover 3 different types of recall in this video, which include studying about serial recall, free recall, and queued recall. Under queued recall, we also aim to cover the concept of memory queues and study about the encoding specificity rules or principles. We then move on to the second type of retrieval, which pertains to studying about recognition. We then move on to the next type of retrieval, which is relearning. Following this, we then move on to the last part of the video, wherein we talk about interference with retrieval or retrieval interference in general, and cover the 2 main types of retrieval interference. The first one is proactive interference and the second one is retroactive interference. Alright, so with that said, let's proceed today's video. Over the last few videos, we saw that memory formation occurs over 3 distinct stages. In the last 2 videos, we covered in detail about the first and the second stage, and in today's video, we will focus in detail about the final stage, that is, memory retrieval. So let's start by asking the question, what is memory retrieval? Memory retrieval, as in the name, is a process of actively bringing back or retrieving any or all specific relevant information to one's current attention from one's stored memory reserves of long-term memory or LTM. Now, with an understanding of the definition of memory retrieval, let's move on to studying about the types of memory retrieval. There are 3 main types of memory retrieval, namely recall, recognition, and relearning. Let's study in detail about each of these types, starting with the first type, recall. Now, recall is a type of memory retrieval which essentially refers to reproducing information from one's long-term memory reserves to their current attention or consciousness. And ideally, recalling allows us to retrieve information without the help of any memory cues. However, this is not always the case, as in some specific scenarios, recall is initiated as a function of memory cue presentations. In summary, recall is a process which simply facilitates the transfer of information from one's LTM reserves to one's current attention with, or in some cases without, a memory cue. Now that we know what recall is, let's look at the different types of recall. There are three key types of recall. The first one is a serial recall, the second one is free recall, and the final one is cued recall. Let's look at each of these types of recall in a little more detail. Serial recall simply refers to recalling information sequentially in the order in which they have occurred. For example, if a friend asks you about your morning routine and you recall the events in the order in which they occurred, such as woke up in the morning, brushed my teeth, washed my face, took a bath, and finally had my breakfast, you essentially undertook serial recall. Now, two types of effects can impact our serial recall abilities and the accuracy of serial recall. The first effect is referred to as the recency effect, and the second is referred to as the primacy effect. Recency effect occurs when we tend to recall the information that was active in the most recent past. For example, in a study undertaken by Glasner and Kunitz in 1966, they observed that participants tend to recall the words in the end of the list better than those in the middle of the list. The recency effect has also been considered as evidence for the existence of short-term memory storage, or STM, and thus evidence for the Atkinson and Schifrin's multi-store memory model, which we covered in the last memory storage video. Now, the second type of effect that impacts serial recall is the primacy effect. Primacy effect refers to the ability to recall those events or information which occurs or appears originally in the earlier part of the list or an earlier time, that is, which were right at the start or beginning of an event or a list. The same study by Glasner and Kunitz, undertaken in 1966, found evidence for the primacy effect. In the same study, they observed that participants were able to better recall the words at the start of the list, along with the words in the end of the list, showing evidence for the recency effect, but not so much those in the middle of the list. Now, the primacy effect finds evidence and support for the long-term memory storage, or LTM reserves, that we discussed in our previous video, and therefore the primacy effect also finds evidence for the Atkinson and Schifrin's multi-store memory model. Moving on, the next type of recall that we cover is free recall. Moving on, the next type of recall that we cover is called as free recall. Free recall refers to recalling information in any order of occurrence without any regard for the order in which they occurred. Imagine the same example wherein you are trying to recall your morning routine. If your friend asks you to recall your morning routine and you start with recalling that you first woke up and then undertook the other activities like washing your face, brushing your teeth, eating your breakfast and bathing, then you just undertook free recall of the activities you did in the morning, even though the order in which you might have done them was not maintained in your recall. This is an example of free recall. Let's now move on to the last type of recall, which is cued recall. Now, cued recall refers to recalling information when it has been activated because of an external element referred to as a memory cue. A memory cue is anything that was either a part of the experience or environment in which the information was being encoded and stored, and that earns the property of activating and initiating the memory because it was a part of the experience, the context, or the environment in which the information was being encoded and stored. Now, usually, retrieval in the form of recall does not always require a cue to initiate and activate the memory, but cues actively facilitate, in some specific scenarios, the recall of information, and they can aid both serial as well as free recall. Let's look at an example to understand cued recall a little better. Imagine you went for a vacation wherein, in a few occasions, you consumed a specific type of wine called rosé. Although you did not actively mean for this drink to be associated with the encoding of the vacation memories, the drink becomes a memory cue such that in a different occasion, when you see or drink rosé, you immediately recall the information about your vacation when you had this drink and all the associated events that might have occurred. So, this is an example of a cued recall wherein the drink rosé becomes a memory cue because it is a part of the experience of the memory of your vacation and thus gets associated with these memories of your vacation, whereby enabling a cued recall of the same in an unrelated occasion. And in fact, memory cues play a very important role in scaffolding memory retrieval. Let's dive a little deeper into this and understand memory cues a little better and understand how these cues can impact our memory retrieval and recall. As stated before, memory cues are any item, context, or situation that share similarities with the items or information stored in one's memory, such that they have the power and ability to evoke the alike items and information stored in one's memory, such as the memory cue rosé that we just observed in the example of rosé and vacation. Memory cues can be of various types. They can be auditory memory cues, visual memory cues, odor-based or smell-based memory cues, and contextual memory cues. Let's now move on to understanding the concept of encoding specificity principle, a principle that explains how memory retrieval cues help us in retrieving information. Now, the general principle that underlies the effectiveness of retrieval cues is the encoding specificity principle that was proposed by psychologists Stelving and Thompson in 1973. This principle states that when people encode information, they do so in specific ways. For example, take the example of a song on the radio that you heard. Perhaps you heard it while you were at a terrific party, having a great philosophical conversation with a friend. This song became a part of the whole complex experience, just like the drink rosé in our vacation example. Years later, even though you haven't thought about that party in ages, when you hear that song on the radio, the whole experience rushes back to you. In general, the encoding specificity principle states that the extent of retrieval cue matches or overlaps the memory trace of an experience, it will be active in evoking the memory. In a classic experiment undertaken by the a classic ex- Let's now move on to understanding the concept of encoding specificity principle, a principle that explains how memory retrieval cues help us in retrieving information. Now, the general principle that underlies the effectiveness of retrieval cues is the encoding specificity principle that was proposed by psychologists Stelving and Thompson in 1973. This principle states that when people encode information, They do so in specific ways. For example, take the example of a song on the radio that you heard. Perhaps you heard it while you were at a terrific party, having a great philosophical conversation with a friend. The song became a part of the whole complex experience, just like the drink rosé in our vacation example. Years later, even though you haven't thought about that party in ages, when you hear that song on the radio, the whole experience rushes back to you. In general, the encoding specificity principle states that the extent of retrieval cue matches or overlaps the memory trace of an experience, it will be active in evoking the memory. A classic experiment on encoding specificity principle was undertaken by researchers Gordon and Baddeley in 1975. In this study, participants had to memorize a set of words in a unique setting. Let's call it context A. Later, the participants were tested on the word sets either in the same location, that is the context A, where they learned the words, or a different location, which for this example we can call context B. The results of this study indicated that as a function of the encoding specificity principle, the students taking the test in context A, when they'd learned the words, were actually able to recall more words than the students who took the test in context B. In this instance, the physical context, which is where they took the test itself, proved to be working as a cue of retrieval. So that is the end of the section where we study about the first type of retrieval, which is recall. Let's now move on to the next type of retrieval, which is recognition. So, what is recognition? Recognition is a type of retrieval wherein we retrieve information by relying on identifying the information on hand from our previously stored and encoded information as and when we come across it. A common example of recognition retrieval is the one that occurs during MCQ tests. Now, unlike memory recall, excepting cued recall, recognition is always having a memory cue to initiate the retrieval. For example, in an MCQ test, this would be the options that we have for each question. This is one reason why recognition usually leads to better retrieval than recall in some scenarios. Now, while retrieval via recognition can usually do a better job of retrieving information as compared to recall, this is not always the case. In some cases, retrieval via recognition can fail retrieving the information with high levels of accuracy or completely abolish the recall altogether. This usually occurs in situations wherein recognition of the memory cue fails. For example, suppose you had a task of recognizing the surnames of famous authors. If I give you the cue, George Bernard, you might be able to recall Shaw as the surname. But if I give you the surname Shaw as a memory cue, it might be difficult to retrieve the first name from recognition retrieval. This tendency is referred to as recognition failure of recallable words effect. Empirical evidence for this effect was accounted by Mutter in 1984 with a study with the names of famous writers. The results of the study indicated that recognition tests with names cues such as Shaw led to lower retrieval rates as opposed to names cues such as Shakespeare or Tolstoy. So, why does this failure in recognition occur? As stated previously, failure to recognize the cue is a key reason for this effect. It is important to note that the different cues evoke different memories of the same target, and that this could lead to the failure in recognizing the cue for retrieval. The second aspect goes back to the encoding specificity principle that we spoke about previously. The recognition failure of recallable words highlights the point that a cue will be most effective depending on the information that has been attached to that particular cue while encoding. The point is, the cue that works best to evoke retrieval are those that recreate the event or the name to be remembered, whereas sometimes even the target itself, such as the surname Shaw in the above example, is not the best cue. Which cue will be most effective depends on the information that has been encoded. Let's now move on to the last type of memory retrieval, which is relearning. So, what is relearning? Relearning is a type of retrieval in which a previously encoded information resurfaces into our memory due to re-encountering the same information again, but after a long period of time. Let's look at an example to understand this better. Retrieval type. Let's now move on to the last part of the video wherein we talk about the concept of retrieval interference. So, what is retrieval interference? Retrieval interference essentially refers to a state wherein an individual undergoes conflict between the information that is stored at a differing time gap or temporal delay, which in turn interferes with the retrieval of the specific information that they want to recall, recognize, or relearn. Now, there are two key types of retrieval interferences that can occur. The first one is proactive interference, and the second one is a retroactive interference. Let's look at what each of these types are and then understand them with an example. A retroactive interference is an interference that occurs when a newly learned piece of information from one's long-term memory interferes with encoding, storage, and recall or retrieval of a previous information piece. Let's look at an example. Imagine you've got a new phone number and you've learned it and you remember it well. Now, in a certain occasion, maybe you need to recall your previous old phone number. You might have difficulties in doing that because you remember your new number and that the new number is now interfering with the recall of your old number. This is an example of retroactive interference. The proactive interference, on the other hand, is just the opposite of retroactive interference. In the proactive interference, the previously learned information from one's long-term memory interferes with the encoding, recall, retrieval, and storage of any new information that you aim to learn. Let's look at the same example of phone numbers. Imagine again that you have gotten a new number and you are trying to learn this new phone number, but the information stored pertaining to your old phone number is not allowing you to learn the information of your new number. This is an example of proactive interference. Thank you for watching and thank you for your attention. If you found value in today's video and want to follow through the entire memory series as well as other upcoming videos on cognitive psychology, neuroscience, psychology in general, and research methods used in these fields, please make sure to subscribe to our channel Brain Cyclopedia. Also, like this video, send us a comment and share this video with someone you think will benefit. Do not forget to press the bell icon as it will help you stay updated with all the recent uploads in this channel. Make sure to follow us on all of our social media sites on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can find the link of all of these platforms pinned to the comment section below on the channel banner as well as in the description. See you in our next video.